Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we're talking about just what the hell is going on in the economy. I'm Eleanor Johnston-Leake. I'm the senior content producer here at the Australia Institute. And back from his holiday, I'm talking to our chief economist, Greg Jericho. Hello, Greg.
Hi, Eleanor.
How was your holiday?
It was lovely. Got to see some whales.
Oh my gosh, that's exciting.
Yeah, very thrilling.
We missed you here at the podcast. We're glad to have you back. So, Greg, before we get into talking about what the hell is going on in the Australian economy, the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, has just released its update on the global economy. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, the IMF every 6 months puts out what it calls its World Economic Outlook. It does it in April and October, and then in July and January it does kind of an update on the updates, sort of a mid-update review. And one of the things I love about the World Economic Outlook, and I can't believe I just said that statement.
Yeah, it's a bit of a nerdy thing to say.
Is that they never hide what's going on. They pretty much stick it on the title of the thing. And the title for this update is The Global Economy in a Sticky Spot.
Right.
Which, they never try and sort of sugarcoat it. And
that's
it really,
refreshing, really.
Yeah. It's kind of, especially around the GFC and even during the pandemic, they were pretty blunt about it, in the pandemic. The title was A Crisis Like No Other, and, the Great Lockdown. God. And so it can be really doom and gloom. And the global economy in a sticky spot, what they're really playing on there is the fact that the global economy is sticky purely because inflation seems to be a bit stickier than was hoped to be.
What do you mean when you say inflation is sticky? It's
not going down as fast as they would like. It's sort of sticking around, like in Australia, rather than falling below 3%, it's sticking in that sort of 3.5% to 4% range. It's not dropping. And that brings with it a whole range of concerns, but the big one that probably listeners are going to care about is the fact that what they're really saying is central banks around the world probably are not going to cut interest rates as much as they would have hoped, or even at all in the sort of the short term. So we can kind of expect things to be a bit tough in that regard.
When I was in the fourth grade, a career politician by the name of Joe Biden supported NAFTA, a bad trade deal that sent countless good jobs to Mexico.
The economy collapsed. There were no jobs. Unemployment rate rose to 15%. It was terrible.
We had the greatest economy in the history of our country. We have never done so well. Everybody was amazed by it. Other countries were copying us.
When I was a sophomore in high school, that same career politician named Joe Biden gave China a sweetheart trade deal that destroyed even more good American middle-class manufacturing jobs.
But he's got the largest deficit in the history of our country, and he's got the worst situation with China. China's going to own us if you keep allowing them to do what they're doing to us as a country. They are killing us as a country, Joe, and you can't let that happen. You're destroying our country.
So apart from sticky inflation, the IMF seems to be concerned in their report about escalating trade tensions and increased policy uncertainty. Why are they so concerned about this? What's going on in the global economy?
Basically, without naming him, they're basically saying Donald Trump could be a risk.
He must not be named.
Yeah, it's a short little update, and in it that has a brief paragraph where it points out that countries, which we're not going to name, but countries and politicians who we're not going to specifically point out, need to be mindful of not pursuing very sort of domestic, inward-looking policies. And what they're really talking about there is tariffs. And this is the big thing with Donald Trump, is his policy at the moment is to introduce a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports into the US and a 10% tariff on all other imports.
Wow.
Imports. So, it's pretty radical, and if he actually follows through on it, it's going to have some pretty drastic implications for what's going on in the economy. And, for people who are wondering, what's the problem with the tariff? A tariff is essentially, it's a bit like a consumption tax, like a GST. It's just a GST on imports. And so if you levy a 60% tax on Chinese goods, then that is basically saying Chinese imports, the things they get from China, and America gets a lot of things from China, the price of those will go up 60%. Unless companies like Walmart or something decide, we will not pass on that tariff cost, we'll take the loss, which companies generally don't do. It's done to try and make things easier for the local businesses because, if you're competing against Chinese companies, suddenly Chinese products cost 60% more.
Yeah.
So that means people will be more likely to buy your products, or you can pay your workers a bit more and all that. And it sounds wonderful. The problem is it raising the price on everything.
Yeah.
Let's say you increase the price on imported cars. You might think, that saves the local car industry, and it might, but it has ramifications elsewhere because people are having to spend more money on cars because cars are more expensive. That means they spend less money elsewhere. That means there are fewer jobs in other parts of the economy, and it kind of it's just not a good thing. And the thing that everyone refers to is back during 1930, during the Great Depression, the US increased tariffs massively, thinking, this will help save the economy, and it sent it into a deeper depression. So, that's a scary sort of thing, and that's why the IMF is probably looking at the polls and going, oh my God, Trump's probably going to be in.
As of time of recording, it looks not good.
Well, breaking news, Joe Biden has COVID. That's probably not going to help.
Wait, does he actually?
Yeah, he's got COVID.
I missed that.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
And just in case your week couldn't get any worse.
Let's not speak too quickly.
So, with Trump being the prohibitive favorite at the moment, the IMF and other organizations are starting to look at, okay, well, what is this actually going to mean? And if he puts in these what we call very protectionist policies, the other problem will be is that other countries might retaliate. They'll say
China retaliates.
Yeah, China retaliates, Japan retaliates, and they say, right, you're putting a 10% tariff on our goods, we'll put a 10% tariff on your exports to us.
Does China import more goods from the US than the US does from China?
No, China is a major exporter.
Yeah.
China sends a lot more stuff to America than it gets from America, and it's the same here in Australia. Interestingly, we're the opposite. We get a lot more stuff from America than we export to it. Our major export countries are China, Japan, Korea, India, and then the fifth is US in terms of where we send our exports. But in terms of imports, number one is China and number two is US. So we get a lot more stuff. So in a sense, directly, this is not going to affect us as much as it might have in the past, when we certainly did send a lot more of our exports to the US and China was less important. But it's just going to be bad for the world economy. America is still the big dog. If America,
as of time of recording,
if America goes into a recession, which is the type of thing that could occur with these type of policies, it's very difficult for the rest of the world not to follow, especially when we're already, in fairly precarious sort of positions as we are.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about what this means for Australia? Could we potentially go into a depression because of the United States?
Well, not a depression. Depression is unlikely. In fact, no, we're not going to go into a depression.
Okay.
I mean, Great Depression, we're not going to have a depression. Recession, though, certainly. I mean, you think about the fact that our economy is already struggling. When we think about recessions and you just need, 6 months of the economy going backwards, well, in the most recent GDP figures, it grew by 0.1%, which is nothing. If you take out population, we've been going backwards for more than a year. So we're already kind of teetering on that brink. And because a lot of our growth comes from exports, if the global trade system starts shutting up its borders and everyone starts fighting against everybody, we could become victims of that fairly easily.
Yeah.
So that's a big concern. I think the other broader concern is one of the things that tariffs do is because they raise prices on everything, that's not good for inflation. So if you're in a situation where we try to bring down prices, putting a consumption tax, a tariff on everything is not going to be good. But really what the major problem is, it just because everything costs more, especially in America, households in America basically are kind of stuffed. So shopping and jobs and everything in America starts going downhill. So maybe that all flows on. It's not the biggest concern I have about a Trump presidency. I'm more concerned about the fact that that's the end of climate change. Things like that. The fact that it might be the end of democracy and things like that. But, we're not going to directly get impacted by the fact that Trump might start targeting minorities and migrants in America, but we certainly will feel the effects of his sort of very protectionist economic policies. And it's probably why you're seeing our current US ambassador, Kevin Rudd, sucking up like mad to the Republicans and Trump and talking to J.D. Vance, his VP pick, and making it sound like, you guys are great.
If President Trump is elected on the 5th of November, we're not going over some chasm. For us in Australia and for allies in the United States, this is a perfectly navigable and manageable set of relationships for the next 4 years.
If you're an ambassador or any country at the moment, you're trying hard to go, okay, yep, you can put tariffs on everyone else, but hey, we're your mates.
Yeah.
We've been
different.
with you all the way. So if you can just get him to think, oh yeah, this will be a good deal for me.
Yeah.
So
don't worry, Greg. All of our hopes rest in the hands of both Kevin Rudd and the American voting population as a whole.
All right. Yeah. And and the doctors treating Joe Biden. Oh God, this has taken a very dark turn.
Sorry, guys. All right. Well, on to something slightly different. In the report, the IMF has revised down its projection of Australia's economic growth very slightly.
Yeah, the IMF in their report, what they do is they make predictions for economic growth in pretty much every country, certainly the major economies in the world, for the current year and for the next year. And then every 3 months it updates those figures. And in April, it was predicting that GDP growth this year for Australia would be 1.5%, which just to reiterate, that is historically terrible. We generally are aiming for around 2.8%. 3% is better. So we're basically,
it's a pretty big difference.
We're going at half the speed that we should be. Not good at all. They've revised that down now to 1.4. 1.5, 1.4.
Yeah.
It's really what they don't actually explain why they did it. One of the very humbling things when you read IMF reports is Australia actually doesn't get much of a mention. We only, if you do a search for Australia, we just come in the tables where they've got the figures. They don't focus a hell of a lot of attention on us. But basically what would have happened is we know the Reserve Bank as well has been, revising down figures. There's just been a couple more months of economic data that they go, it's probably going to be more likely to be a bit weaker than a bit stronger. They didn't change the estimates for next year's growth. It's 2%, which again, terrible.
Yeah.
So they're not saying it looks like things are going to be worse next year than they thought, but it's still a case of, they're not going to be better. And to be honest, they kind of did that for most of the world. There wasn't a lot of movement. The US, they downgraded their growth again, just 0.1%, and they made no changes for next year. So it was kind of just a bit of, things were as weak and terrible as we thought they were 3 months ago, maybe a little bit weaker, but
But everyone else is also doing weak and terribly, so.
Yeah.
Greg, your column this week in The Guardian focuses on how the Australian economy is going sort of as a whole. And you mentioned that in May, unemployment was 4%. Doesn't that mean that things are going sort of okay-ish?
It does normally. And we should highlight that by the time people are listening to this, the latest June unemployment figures will come out. They probably might go up a little bit. They might go down a bit. What my whole point of the column is saying is that in the past, if we'd had unemployment at 4%, we'd go, man, things must be absolutely humming along. I mean, I'm in my early 50s and I've been basically in the labour market workforce for, 30 years. And through most of that time, having an unemployment rate of 4% was almost kind of, well, that's sort of fantasy land sort of stuff or something. As we saw in around 2008, we were having the mother of all mining booms and just this is incredible. Whereas we've now been at 4% or below that for, over a year now. And you'd be thinking, wow, things are going great.
Yeah. Are things going great?
No. Well, this is the thing. I sort of looked at it and go, okay, if things are going great, that would mean the Reserve Bank's thinking we probably should raise interest rates because everything's hot. People are spending madly. Everyone's got jobs. Everyone's feeling good. The economy looks like it is just surging along. And the problem with just looking at the unemployment rate, which is an important figure, is it can miss a lot of things. And so what I tried to do was unpick a bit, sort of, as I always like saying, sort of lift up the hood and have a look at what's actually going on with the engine. And one of the things we looked at was, underemployment, which is a measure of how much people are working and whether they would want to work more. If you're working part-time, some people are happy to work part-time, others actually, I want more hours. And if you want more hours, you're actually underemployed. And that can happen because you're working part-time, you want to work full-time, or maybe you're even working part-time and your hours are being cut back. You don't want to work full-time, but you'd like to work more than the 15 hours you're getting now. You want to work 25, 30 hours. So when underemployment starts rising, that's a sign of a bit of weakness in the economy. And so what we also do is we add unemployment and underemployment together to get a thing that we called underutilization. Lots of unders there. But that gives us a sort of a real broad sense of how the labour market is going. And while unemployment is kind of at historic lows, underutilization, when you combine those two things together, has started rising a bit, and it's no longer at a point where you think, we've never seen this before. We did see the same sort of level during the mining boom years, but it wasn't, we're nowhere near it where you think, oh God, there's no way it could go lower than this. We're running at full capacity. So I was looking at that, and also, looking at, okay, employment's going okay. It's been growing well, but where are those jobs?
Yeah.
What are the jobs that are powering it? And one of the interesting things here is that you can split up the economy essentially into two parts. The market sector, so kind of the private sector, where if that's going well, that's because people are out there spending, they're going to the shops, they're wanting to build new houses, they're doing all these, buying new services, all of that. Things are going great. And the other sector is what we call the non-market sector, which is mostly public sector, but also things like just health and education, which can be private. But like if you're going to a dentist, you're generally not shopping around for, who's got the lowest price. You don't choose a dentist like you choose, buying jeans or things like that. Where
you kind of go to the same person
and
over and over
there's
again.
You don't hear, the dentist has got a sale on fillings this week or things.
I
it's
wish.
Just, exactly. So we call that the non-market sector because even if it's not done by public servants, they're not really competing on price and things like that. And what we find is that over the past year, most of the job growth has come in that non-market sector, especially in health and social assistance, which basically means NDIS, has been a big driver of employment growth. And in that market sector, in those industries and sectors where you think, that's where people are out there spending more money and there's a lot of demand and everyone's, going mad, there's been bugger all growth, like essentially no increase in jobs over the past year. And that's a real sign that actually maybe we got good low unemployment, but that might be more because, the government is spending a heck of a lot of money on NDIS and the education services and things like that, which necessary and it's great. And certainly, yes, governments do create jobs, but it's not really a sign of, the Reserve Bank should be raising interest rates to slow things down because I can tell you, it's not going to have an impact on whether or not you want to go to the doctor or not. Okay, it's going to hurt whether you can afford it, but, if you need root canal,
you need a root canal.
Yeah. If you've broken your leg, you need to get that fixed. Those things generally don't get affected by interest rates. So if you're looking at the unemployment rate and going, hell, 4%,
yeah,
the Reserve Bank's got to step in here. Things are going too fast. No wonder inflation is rising. I'd be like, what? You think that the fact that there's a lot of public servants, a lot of occupational therapists and speech therapists and people working in the social sectors and teachers, that needs to be slowed down,
That sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But also the fact that the private sector, the market sector, there isn't a lot of jobs. That suggests actually the economy, the sort of the economy that is affected by interest rates is actually already pretty bloody weak. It's just holding steady, and what is keeping everything low, keeping the unemployment rates low and things like that, are those non-market sector increases in jobs. And the fact that underemployment is rising, where are you going to see a big increase in underemployment? It's in that market sector where shops are going, we're going to cut back on hours this week because there's not a lot of business.
Like retail hours.
Yeah, retail hours
hospitality.
Hospitality. Yeah, we don't need 4 people on for this Saturday shift. We only need 3, so we're going to cut back or things like that. And so that's where you really start to see the signs that actually the economy is not as strong as a 4% unemployment rate might suggest it is.
So if that's the situation that we're in now, is that, do you think, some kind of new normal, or what's the situation that we might look to in the future?
Yeah, one of the things about the unemployment rates and all that is they're actually backward looking. They're looking at what's happened in previous months. We also have some data that kind of gives us an indication of where things are going to be headed. And one of the really good ones is a survey done by the government, the Department of Jobs and Skills, looks at recruiting intentions by employers. They actually survey and say, are you thinking that you're going to increase staff over the next 3 months? Or have you even tried to recruit people this month? If businesses are doing a lot of recruitment, that probably means unemployment's going to go down. Things are good because they think we need more staff. And what we've seen is that there has been a pretty sharp drop in the intentions of companies to recruit or add staff in the next 3 months. And also there has been a pretty significant drop in the percentage of companies that are now recruiting as well. So again, this underlines this sense of, you can't raise interest rates by 3.25 percentage points and it not have an impact. It's having an impact. Companies are going, people aren't able to afford to come and buy our stuff or pay for my services, so I don't need more staff. I'm pretty good, thanks. And I was optimistic 3 months ago, I'm less optimistic now, or I'm more pessimistic now. And so it's a real sort of indicator that I think employers, companies, businesses, small businesses especially, from the figures, are really doing it tough. They're struggling. Unless you're in that sort of NDIS health space, there's just been a really significant drop-off, even over the last 6 months. Certainly 2 years ago when we're coming out of pandemic, everyone was hiring. It was like, we're open for business again. And
everyone's got money they want to spend.
Started slowing down, but the last 6 months, we've really seen a fairly significant drop-off across the board. And it really is a sign of, things aren't as strong as you might think if you just go 4% unemployment. What's everyone complaining about?
And so you would hope that the RBA would be looking at this data and saying, maybe we shouldn't increase interest rates. But do you think that is something that is important to them in their decision making?
It is. It is really important. And I hope the RBA is reading my column.
Or listening to this podcast.
Of course they would be.
Yeah.
How could you not? And I do know they read my column because occasionally I get some comments from the Reserve Bank about my columns. But they're very mindful of this. This has been what they've been talking about, trying to thread the needle or, come in for a soft landing, because they want to get inflation down, but they don't want to crash the economy. They don't want to send unemployment soaring. Because, to be honest, actually getting inflation down, well, it's kind of easy. You just kill the economy.
Yeah.
You take away the ability to have people to be able to spend by raising interest rates, jack them up as fast and high as you can. People don't have money to spend. People aren't hiring. Businesses go broke. Yeah, inflation goes down.
Nosedive the economy.
The problem is it kills the economy, and it is very difficult to restart an economy or get an economy going again, as anyone who lived through the 1990s recession will know. So they're very mindful of this. And this is why I kind of, and I'm always terrible about predicting, but my suspicion is they won't raise interest rates. They'll be more likely to do nothing and just go, right. The risk of unemployment rising, the economy slowing too much is greater than the fact that we've got some sticky inflation. So long as inflation does not seem to be rising again at a pace that they're not comfortable with, if it just sort of is bouncing between 3.6%, 4%, which, can be affected by, one-off sort of things. Maybe petrol prices went up that quarter. Maybe there was a big jump in gas prices, things like that. They might just go, look, yeah, but if we raise interest rates, what's that actually going to do? We know wage growth has peaked. Wage growth is already slowing. So it's a case of, well, why are we raising interest rates if we're trying to get sort of wages to calm down when they're already calmed down? If we look at employment growth, things aren't that great. So unless we get some very surprising figures from the unemployment and from inflation, I kind of think they'll be more like to have a watching brief, although they have sort of been a bit more bolshy in terms of, we're ready to act. But I would hope that they would see there's not a lot to be gained by them raising interest rates, because it's not going to slow the areas of the economy that are doing well, because that's the areas that aren't really affected by, higher interest rates. Education, healthcare, not going to be affected really. So in my regard, and this is something I've been saying for a while, because these figures kind of back up what we've been looking at, is that trying to raise interest rates to cure inflation is treating the problem of inflation incorrectly. The diagnosis is wrong. And so hopefully they listen to us, because otherwise I would start getting very worried about unemployment starting to rise. And that ain't good.
So what you're saying, Greg, is as long as a certain election somewhere overseas doesn't cause prices to go up and therefore cause inflation globally, including here in Australia, we'll be fine, is what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a case of inflation is not as bad as rising unemployment.
Yeah.
If you were to have inflation go from 3.5% to 4%, that is actually worse than unemployment going from 3.5% to 4%, because we're actually talking the lives and the livelihoods of people who are suddenly out of work. And that's very hard to undo.
Well, I reckon that's probably all we've got time for today, Greg. Thank you so much for being here.
No problems, Eleanor. Always wonderful to be here and wonderful to be back. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be back next week with another Dollars and Cents. This episode of Dollars and Cents was recorded on Thursday, the 18th of July, and some things may have changed, including the unemployment rate. You can find my column, Grogonomics, which delves into what is actually going on with the labour market and employment, on the Guardian Australia site. But for more research, especially on what we argue is driving inflation, on our website, which is at australiainstitute.org.au. My Twitter handle and the handle I use at all social media is @GrogsGamut, and Eleanor's is
@EleanorJ_L. That's Eleanor ELINOR.
Excellent. Our theme music is from Blue Dot Sessions. See you all next week.
Bye.